A decision to cancel a presidential primary and the state's newest Supreme Court justice are just a few topics generating controversy in Arizona politics this month. We now go beyond the headlines with the Yellow Sheet's Hank Stephenson. Hank, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
Let's start off with Arizona not having a Republican presidential primary. That's because President Trump is just that strong in the state?
It's because the party with an incumbent president doesn't want to give critics a platform. Let's face it, Trump would win a primary in Arizona. Whether that's with 70%, 95% of the vote, he would definitely win. But if he shows up with 70% of the vote, that really undermines his position as the president. And I think the GOP doesn't want to see that happen.
The Arizona GOP President Kelly Ward says, essentially the Trump train is moving very fast, but admittedly there are probably Republicans out there who don't support President Trump. What will they make of all this?
Well, I think you'll have some people who are upset about it, but frankly, Democrats canceled their presidential preference election when Obama was running for a second term. Republicans canceled it when George W. Bush was running for a second term. Democrats canceled it when Bill Clinton was running for a second term. So while people who don't have the historical knowledge to remember those things are kind of throwing up their hands and saying that this is the GOP rigging an election for Trump, it's pretty normal for this to happen.
Okay, let's move on to a major decision by the Arizona Supreme Court. Even the U.S. Supreme Court hasn't quite touched this one. Remind our viewers what took place.
So what happened was there was a calligraphy shop that does wedding invitations run by two Christian women who did not want to do wedding invitations to a gay wedding. It was in Phoenix, so that was covered under Phoenix's anti-discrimination ordinance. This finally went up to the Supreme Court, which reversed the lower court's decision and actually sided with Brush and Nib. They wrote a very tailored opinion saying that this only applies to this case. It only applies to these wedding invitations, not other things they may do wedding related. Tried to write it as narrow as possible.
So could there be an appeal, or what's next?
This is it for this case. Right now, the Brush and Nib doesn't have to provide invitations to same-sex weddings. There's still a lot of questions about, what does this mean for other businesses run by Christians who have a religious belief that they shouldn't be participating in a gay wedding. I think that's what we'll see next, is other businesses in Phoenix, Tempe, Tucson, cities that actually do have non-discrimination ordinances protecting gay people, bringing their own suits and pointing to the Brush and Nib case, saying, look what you did here, Supreme Court.
Let's talk about the Arizona Supreme Court, because Governor Ducey's one of his most recent nominations, Bill Montgomery. Why is his appointment so controversial?
Well, he's a very controversial figure. He's a very socially conservative, tied in with a lot of the Ducey allies, has had a host of high-profile, headline-grabbing moments. There's actually a bar complaint against Bill Montgomery right now. He's the first Supreme Court justice that we know of to ever be appointed to the court while having a looming bar complaint hanging over him.
Isn't there a commission in place, though, who's supposed to help monitor this and perhaps guide the governor in his decision-making?
There is. The first time this year, Bill Montgomery applied for the gig, really faced some tough questionings from that commission, and they decided that he was unfit to be on the Supreme Court and didn't push his name along. After that, Ducey appointed, I believe it was 4 new members of that commission, 3 of whom we know that Montgomery was lobbying. He comes up for the same job a few months later, very few questions. He was approved, sent to the governor, and lo and behold, that was the governor's pick.
Let's look ahead to the next legislative session. The House Speaker Rusty Bowers made a comment this week about radicalizing children in this process of looking at sex education differently in schools. Why did it become a partisan issue?
Well, what he said really was that one of the things he said in that hour-long kind of presentation that he gave to a group, anti-LGBT group out in Gilbert, was that this is part of Planned Parenthood's business strategy, to sexualize children at a young age so that they get STDs, so that they get AIDS, so that they get pregnant, so that Planned Parenthood can provide services to those people for money. It was a pretty jaw-dropping belief, even for somebody like Rusty Bowers. He's a very older, conservative Mormon man from East Mesa. And part of it was that our sex ed programs, that the superintendent of public instruction, Kathy Hoffman, is trying to radicalize children as part of this conspiracy with Planned Parenthood, sexually radicalize children, basically to like fund Planned Parenthood. The whole thing doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
If there's no move to challenge what he said, does it hold any weight in these conversations that many districts are having about how to move forward with sex ed right now?
I don't know how much a school district looks at the Speaker of the House of Representatives and really cares what he says unless, he's putting it into some sort of law. I think that there has been increased attention both by school districts and state legislators on sex education and what to do with that. So maybe that kind of plays in as lawmakers tinker with the laws around sex education next year, which I would expect them to want to do. But I don't think that just this statement itself is really going to sway a school district when they're deciding what kind of sex ed curriculum they want to teach to their students.
Okay, Hank Stephenson from the Yellow Sheet Report. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.